Thank you, Elaine. I'm very pleased to be here with you all today, and just want to acknowledge where we are on Treaty 1 territory in the homeland of the Métis. And I also wanted to acknowledge my friend Steve and Stan, who last winter sometime invited me to, said, we're going to do an event and can you come? So I'm pleased to be here with you today. And in addition, I just wanted to say, in terms of introducing myself, I'm the daughter of Sarah Jane and Richard Preston and the mother of Sarah Jane Howe. I was born in the territory of the Lenene Lape. I spent a fair amount of my childhood in the territory of the Cree of Iuiski in northern Quebec. And I now live in traditional Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee territory in southern Ontario. So before we start, I did want to mention the booklet version of the Declaration. And I work with a coalition of other organizations that are on the back of the booklets. You can see who we all are. And we've reproduced about 300,000 of these booklets at this point. We first printed them after the Declaration was adopted, and we reprint when we run out to circulate more. I had someone from the Canadian Human Rights Commission call me one day, and she said, Jennifer, this is the best known human rights instrument in Canada, and it's because of those booklets. So if you didn't get one, if you don't have one, I urge you to get one. They're back at the tables back there. And there's also a bunch of different resource materials that have been brought. So if you didn't have a chance to see them before you came, do see them before you leave. So we're here today, and this being 146 years since Treaty 1, it's also 10 years since the adoption of the UN Declaration. And the other thing is that it's 2 years since the closing events of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And I was privileged to be part of those closing events in Ottawa. I think some other people that are here were in Ottawa for those closing events, and where they released their 94 calls to action, and also where they had the walk for reconciliation. Their work continued. The formal report didn't come out until December of that year, but those events in June of 2015 were really important, and they were really profound days that we spent in Ottawa at the conclusion of that formal work. So when I spoke to Steve and Stan in the wintertime, they had said, maybe you can come and talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and then where we as settlers and people of faith fit into that. And so that's what I'm going to talk with you here today, and I will save some time at the end for Q&A. And I was actually talking to Steve about this in the car. I said this at another presentation I gave earlier this year. If anything that I say, if you find it that it's, that it troubles you a bit, or you find you're not quite sure about it, I urge you to embrace that and peel the layers back of, why have I made you uncomfortable? What is it that I said that caused you to be uncomfortable, and to explore why. So and feel free to share that with me afterwards as well. Okay, so the TRC. The TRC, I'm sure most of you know, was set up as part of the settlement of what is the largest class action suit in Canada's history. And it was set up, the TRC was set up to do its work as part of, with the organizations and the survivors of the Indian residential school system. And part of their mandate, the description of their work, was the TRC aimed to guide and inspire Aboriginal peoples and Canadians in a process of truth and healing on a path leading towards reconciliation and renewed relationships based on mutual understanding and respect. Now, in opposition to that, the central mandate of the Indian residential school system was to forcibly remove Aboriginal children from their families and to assimilate the children into Canadian society. The intent was to kill the Indian in the child. The actions of the Indian residential school system constitute genocide under international law, and mainly these schools were set up by the federal government of Canada and run by churches. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission conducted its work between 2010 and 2015, and I just wanted to take a moment to offer tribute to the 3 commissioners for the leadership that they gave and the incredible work that they accomplished, and the incredible work that they continue to do. Chief Commissioner, Justice, and now Senator Marie Sinclair, and now Grand Chief Wilton Littlechild, and Dr. Marie Wilson, whose incredible work and incredible commitment that they made ensured that the TRC was able to do quite incredible work. Some of you may have attended events. They had their national events across the country. There was one in your region, so some of you may have been at that, and as well as other events. The commissioners, as well as those big national events, the commissioners crossed and crisscrossed the country doing all kinds of work during that 5-year period, and incredible work, incredible journeys that they went on. And I urge you to read their work, to read not only the 94 calls to action, but read their report, the final report, and they also produced, they produced preliminary reports before their final report. So I urge you, read their work. It is the best history of Canada that you will find. And so I really urge you to explore that. The Indian residential school system was part of the destructive forces of the colonization of Canada in the last 150 years. And so the work that the TRC did informs us of both the journey and the legacy of the colonization. So what did we learn from the TRC? The truth part of the TRC. So we learned about the sexual and physical and spiritual abuse, and we learned about the widespread dispossession of land, about the attempted destruction of traditional governance and legal structures, religious conversion, efforts at forced assimilation, including the prohibition of Indigenous languages and traditional culture and spiritual practices. We learned about the racist and sexist Indian Act legislation, which is still in effect. And we learned about the secondary consequences associated with loss of culture, language, and identity, including intergenerational trauma, which exists in an ongoing way. So what did the TRC suggest to move forward? Once we've learned the truth, where are we going with that information? In one of the reports that they published while they were doing their work, which is called What We Have Learned, Principles of Truth and Reconciliation, they said, reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country. In order for that to happen, there has to be awareness of the past, acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change the behavior. So awareness, acknowledgement, atonement, and action to change. So that's where they took us. So what does reconciliation look like? Reconciliation is a very powerful word. And we could spend all day long talking about what does reconciliation mean, or longer. The TRC, in their work, throughout their reports, throughout the calls to action, the TRC named the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the framework for reconciliation. Sometimes also it's called the blueprint for reconciliation. Now, throughout their work, they went back and back to the UN Declaration. So I think that, and they didn't say it's a framework or part of a framework or you could use it in a framework. They said it's the framework. In two of their calls to act, well, in many of the calls to action, they refer to the Declaration. In Call to Action 43, they call on governments at all levels to adopt and implement the UN Declaration. And they very skillfully have woven the Declaration through their work in such a way that the two are now forever entwined. The Declaration and the calls to action, the report of the TRC all together. So you may see sometimes in the media when people are, or politicians sometimes are undermining the Declaration or calling into question the usefulness of the Declaration. And think that because of the way that it's been used by the TRC, if you're undermining the UN Declaration, you're also undermining reconciliation. You're undermining the work of national reconciliation. As Elaine said, I've done a lot of work. A lot of my professional life has been spent doing work on the Declaration, going back nearly 20 years, first in the development at the UN, and then now working on implementation since its adoption. I'm just going to give a tiny history of the Declaration, of where it came from and why it's important, so we can see how it connects with the work of the TRC. So the Declaration was developed in Geneva at the United Nations over a period of more than 20 years, which makes it the most discussed instrument in the history of the United Nations. And another unique feature, and of course the reason why it took more than 20 years, is because it was quite unique in that the rights holders themselves, Indigenous peoples, played the role in the development of the Declaration as equal participants to state representatives. The UN, in its essence, is a club of nation states. That's what it is. And when standards are developed at the UN, it's generally negotiated amongst governments. There's other players there. The other players can influence what's happening, but essentially it's state negotiations. The UN Declaration was unique in that it was agreed very early on in the process that that would be wholly inappropriate for nation states to be negotiating an instrument while Indigenous peoples sat at the back of the negotiating room listening to them. So early on in the process, it was agreed, because the UN tries to do everything by consensus. So it was agreed that the consensus include the Indigenous representatives. So no document was going to be created solely by states. And Indigenous peoples and states worked together over this long period of time to negotiate what would go into the final instrument. There's more than 370 million Indigenous peoples in more than 70 countries around the world. And the Declaration was an urgently needed addition to the international human rights system. It filled a void in the system. It was widely understood, and it remains widely understood at the international level, that Indigenous peoples on a global scale have suffered and continue to suffer dispossession, marginalization, assimilation from colonization, discrimination, and globally are the most vulnerable to human rights violations, mainly due to dispossession from lands. Now, the journey of that time period in Geneva that the Declaration was adopted is another story that I'm not telling here this afternoon. But I would just say that during that time period, there was many times when it was very questionable whether or not this work could be accomplished. There was many times that, in fact, having a successful outcome was quite doubtful. When I first went to Geneva, and I went as an observer to the process, when I first went, I thought, oh, no, this will never happen, because state representatives were so far from understanding what it was that Indigenous representatives were trying to accomplish there. There was so much distance, and it was Indigenous representatives and leaders came from all corners of the earth, and they brought with them their stories. They brought the story of their people. They brought the story of dispossession. They brought the story of the violations they continued to be facing. And they brought this work, and they shared deeply. And then we had state representatives who were at yet another UN meeting, and they were done the day at 6 o'clock. And so there was a real discrepancy about what people were doing there. But over time, it was kind of an amazing process to watch. Over time, Indigenous reps that did this work were so strong, and they worked with nation states to help the states come further, to help them to understand why we have to go here. And to their credit, there were many nation states that began to really deeply engage at a deep level. And it was the relationships that were built and the states that invested deeply in it, and that we were able to get to a place to be able to produce a declaration. So the declaration was adopted on September 13th, 2007. It was the actual moment of adoption was kind of a small, quiet affair in the halls of the GA. There was 4 states that opposed: Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand. All 4 of those states have now reversed their positions so that it is a consensus international instrument, which adds to its legal significance. It's also been reaffirmed by the UN General Assembly 3 times by consensus, including in an outcome document from the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. The adoption was celebrated globally by Indigenous peoples, the international human rights system, and many member states. It's the most comprehensive international instrument to explicitly address the rights of Indigenous peoples, including the fact that it really focuses on the importance of the collective rights, the collective human rights of Indigenous peoples. It's important to know the Declaration doesn't create new rights. It's the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, and it draws on existing human rights standards that already existed in international law and elaborates them in a context that applies to the reality of Indigenous peoples globally. The Declaration affirms a wide range of political, economic, social, cultural, spiritual, environmental rights, and it represents the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the world's Indigenous peoples. These rights include the enjoyment of all human rights under international law, equality with all other peoples, self-determination, including self-government, the right to live in freedom, peace, and security, the right to traditions, subsistence, and development, the right to spirituality, lands, territories, and resources, and of course, the recognition and enforcement of treaties. Because part of what we're doing here today deals with treaties, I'm just going to read you, there's several. So when you look at the Declaration, there's preambular paragraphs that are not numbered in your booklet, and 3 of the preambular paragraphs specifically deal with treaties, PP 8, 14, and 15. And then Article 37, which is known as the Treaty Article, and was negotiated mainly by Grand Chief Littlechild. And the Treaty Article, Indigenous peoples have the right to recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements concluded with states or their successors, which was important in the case of Canada. Many treaties were negotiated with the British Crown. And to have states honor and respect such treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements. That's the first paragraph of Article 37. Harmonious and cooperative relations between Indigenous peoples and states are promoted, and states are required to establish effective mechanisms in conjunction with Indigenous peoples to resolve issues related to land, territories, and resources where Indigenous peoples have been dispossessed. So where does this take us? We have the work of the TRC, who have said that the Declaration is the framework for reconciliation. We have the UN Declaration. Oh, and I should say, you'll see that I always call it the UN Declaration or the Declaration. So I'm going to ask you if you will please not call it UNDRIP. And I know you're going to hear people call it UNDRIP. I know you're going to see it written out that way. But I'm just going to ask you to please not do that. And the reason I'm asking you that is that many of the Indigenous leaders that worked on creating the Declaration are really opposed to the term UNDRIP, mainly because it's just a yucky acronym. I mean, DRIP, it's not a drip. So I'm going to ask you to, and if you want to use an acronym, I'm going to ask you to use UND, or to call it the Declaration or the UN Declaration. So where are we now? The role of settlers, the role of peoples of faith in this journey, the journey with the TRC and the UN Declaration. I'm going to give you a quote that Murray Sinclair gave to the closing plenary session on those days in Ottawa 2 years ago. He said, "We have described for you a mountain. We have shown you the path to the top. We call upon you to do the climbing." So that's where we are now. All settlers to Canada, whether they are newcomers and new settlers to Canada, or whether their ancestors have been here for hundreds of years, all settlers to Canada have benefited directly or indirectly from the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands and territories. So where are we now? Reconciliation is much more than an apology. Many churches and levels of government have offered apologies. But reconciliation has to include a commitment to change. And it's really crucial if we're going somewhere in this work, if we're actually going to move into a new reality, we have to move away from this colonial paradigm that we've been in from the time that colonization began. We have to move out of that into one that respects Indigenous peoples' self-determination. Self-determination is Article 3 in the Declaration, and it's a key article in the Declaration. So we need, as a collective here, we need to move into a paradigm that respects Indigenous people's self-determination and other human rights. And this paradigm is laid out in the UN Declaration. Reconciliation includes restitution. And I'm just going to read to you Article 28, which deals with redress. Indigenous peoples have the right to redress by means that can include restitution, or when this is not possible, just, fair, and equitable compensation for the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used, and which have been confiscated, taken, occupied, used, or damaged without their free, prior, and informed consent. Unless otherwise freely agreed to upon the peoples concerned, compensation shall take the form of lands, territories, and resources equal in quality, size, and legal status, or of monetary compensation or other appropriate redress. So how do we, as people of faith, actively decolonize? How do we, in our communities, ensure that Canada decolonizes? What is our role in the journey of reconciliation? And how is that role part of our faith? How do we live our faith by gauging in a deep level on this journey? I'm a Quaker, and I've been a Quaker my whole life, so I belong to a peace church. But all faith bodies promote peace and justice. So living in a place of continued injustice is absolutely unacceptable at any level. So we must live our faith by acting for justice. And to do so, we translate faith into action. There's an old Quaker saying that says, "Let your life speak. Climb the mountain." Quakers were involved in the Declaration since the work on the Declaration began in Geneva. And Canadian Quakers formally committed to the implementation of the Declaration before the work of the TRC. And our engagement now at a national level, our engagement with the Declaration, is actually part of our spiritual discipline. Many other Canadian churches have followed that path because of the work of the TRC, and particularly Call to Action 48. Call to Action 48 is the one of the 94 calls to action that had a deadline. They put a deadline. They asked all churches and faith communities to issue a statement where they were making a commitment to the UN Declaration. So many churches have now done that and are engaged in the work around implementation. And I would say that the faithful commitment to the UN Declaration is part of the journey to understand the legacy of colonization and the need to engage in healing and reconciliation. So I'm going to ask you to do two things if you haven't already done them. The two things are, I want you to read the UN Declaration and the 94 calls to action. And there are booklet copies of both here. And I would say, because when people say, well, how do you implement the Declaration? The very first step of implementation is you have to read it. You have to know what's in it before you can do anything with it. So I would say that what I want you to do is I want you to read it, and then I want you to also see yourself in it. I want you to see yourself in those instruments. And in the 94 calls to action, you will find yourself. I mean, the calls to action are aimed so, they're specific, but they're also broad, and they touch on so many sectors of society. You will find yourself in there. So find yourself and then take the action that's there. They specifically, the commissioners called it 94 calls to action. They didn't say we have 94 recommendations, because recommendations, like reports, can get put on a shelf. They said, we have 94 calls to action. We want you to take action. So find yourself in these instruments and then engage in the action that reaches out to you. And I'll give you 2 recent examples. One of the things that the TRC has did, which I'm not sure that they were aware that the level of what they were achieving when they were doing their work, but they have managed to touch so many sectors across our societies. And in so many different ways. It's quite incredible. And I think they raise so many issues to a certain level and such a level of awareness. And that can't be rolled back. You know, the work that they did cannot be pushed back. This is forward momentum work that they have given. It's like such a gift that they have given to all of us. So 2 examples of work that I was recently involved in. I got contacted by the Ontario Public Health, and they said, the calls to action include a directive to public health employees, and we're, you know, could you do us a workshop so we understand something about the UN Declaration? I said, and how it relates to health. So I said, sure. So I did a webinar where it was great technology. I did it from my house, and they had people who work for Ontario Public Health could sign into the webinar at a certain time, and we did a presentation on the UN Declaration and what it means to public health. And that it was direct relationship, that them engaging with the 94 calls to action led to them wanting to do that. And then another one that was just recently, I just returned from British Columbia. The BC Union of Municipalities had invited myself and a colleague to go to BC because there's calls to action that are aimed at municipalities, and they needed to know, well, how do we embrace this? And so they said, can you come and talk to us about the UN Declaration and what we can do at the municipal level? So you see, these are all sectors that across society that may otherwise have never engaged with the UN Declaration. And so now they are, and they're finding themselves in it. And so that's what I encourage all of you to do. Educate yourself and engage. And we currently have a federal government that has committed and recommitted, both politically and legally, to the full and effective implementation of all 94 calls to action, as well as the UN Declaration. So we need to push on this. We need to hold them to account for the commitments that they've made. There's been lots of really powerful political speeches and lots of some actions that are probably more symbolic in what they are. They're good steps, but they're more symbolic steps. But we need to push that, in fact, that we see the action that goes with these commitments. And we feel, the partners that I work with, and certainly in the coalition that I work with, that a legislative framework is necessary to ensure the implementation of the calls to action in the UN Declaration. And that also means that it can survive the life of more than one government. You have such a legislative framework in Manitoba. In Manitoba, in 2016, your provincial government passed what's called the Path to Reconciliation Act, which speaks to both the TRC and the UN Declaration. I have no idea to what level the province is actively engaged in ensuring that legislation is implemented, but I urge you to find out. You know, your elected officials are responsible to you. At the federal level, we have now a private member's bill, C-262, which is the Implementation Act for the UN Declaration, was introduced by Romeo Saganash. Romeo is Cree from Iwichi, and Romeo was involved in the development of the Declaration in Geneva. And I know some of you participated in the recent pilgrimage that was around awareness raising around both the UN Declaration as well as around C-262. And some of you may also be aware of the campaign that Kairos is currently promoting, Let Justice Roll, which is also about promoting awareness around the Declaration and around 262. It's a private member's bill. It's up for second reading sometime, I would say, probably in the next 8 months. Romeo is an NDP MP. We are unclear where the federal government stands on this legislation. When he had previously introduced a another version of this in the last government, which the Liberals had all supported. But that doesn't mean that they'll support it while they're in government, and they've been a bit cagey about that. Recently, I was in New York at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and Indigenous Affairs Minister Carolyn Bennett repeatedly was complimenting Romeo Saganash's work. And so I would hope that that's a positive sign that the government intends to engage with Romeo on that. It may well be that the federal government wants to develop its own legislation around the declaration and implementation of the declaration, which is fine. Government legislation has more power than private members' bills do. And Romeo has even said, you know, I'm happy if the Liberals want to take my work and build on it. What no one would find acceptable is if the federal government wanted to develop their own legislation that's at a lower standard than what Romeo has proposed. The main features in Romeo's bill include some of the things that I've already touched on, you know, repudiating colonization, repudiating the doctrine of discovery, the government working with Indigenous peoples on a national action plan to implement the declaration. And just to be clear, because I think sometimes in the media this has been really unclear, Romeo's legislation does not call for the declaration to become a piece of Canadian law overnight. What he calls for is a process between government and Indigenous peoples to develop what is implementation? How is that going to play out? And for there to be an annual report on what work has been done to make that happen. Now, with the calls to action, there's just a few calls to action I also wanted to highlight. I wanted to highlight call to action 45 and 46, which deal with both a new royal proclamation and also a covenant of reconciliation. And these are sort of similar calls to action, the one aimed at government and the other aimed at faith groups. But in those calls to action, the TRC commissioners are talking also about exactly those same things that Romeo is talking about in 262, talking about the doctrine of discovery and talking about the implementation of the declaration, but also in those two calls to action, talking about the importance of the work on treaties. And so I urge you to look at those calls to actions. One of the other calls to action we just wanted to raise up today, well, the very last two in the calls to action, action 93 and 94, are for newcomers to Canada. And call to action 94 specifically is about the citizenship oath. And you know, other than when I was a child, I was at Janet Ross's citizenship ceremony some years ago, and she became a Canadian. So call to action 94, we call upon the Government of Canada to replace the oath of citizenship with the following. I swear or affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors, and I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada, including treaties with Indigenous peoples, and fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen. So what would that mean? What does it mean to observe Treaty 1? If you live in this territory, it's your treaty too. Indigenous leaders did not enter into treaty to impoverish their people or the future generations to come. So how does the treaty impact your life? And if it doesn't, why not? And how can you find a way that it does? How do you find a way to bring that into your reality? So the last section that I wanted to share with you today is a little bit of discussion about hope and faith. I think about the Indigenous representatives that went to the UN in the beginning to find justice that they could not obtain in the nation states where they reside. And during the development of the text, they overcame seemingly insurmountable challenges. Against all odds, the declaration was achieved. Those Indigenous peoples brought hope and faith that they would create a better world, and indeed they have, and enriched the global human rights system. And I also think about the children in residential schools, and then the adults that came forward during the TRC times to tell their stories at the hearings of the TRC. And they came with the hope and the faith that telling their stories was going to lead to a better world. And the survivors that were present at the closing events in Ottawa, that traveled to be there for that event, that came with the hope and the faith of the impact that that was going to make. I think of the 3 TRC commissioners and the work that they did and the incredible strength it must have taken to do that work, and how they, for 5 years, journeyed and journeyed and journeyed and listened to the stories and listened to stories and listened to people speak stories of unspeakable pain. And I asked Grand Chief Littlechild, we were in New York once, and I said to him, Willie, how do you do it? Like, how do you keep going and hearing these stories and being present and really, really being present for the people who are coming forward to these events? And he just smiled and he said, a lot of exercise and a lot of prayer. I have hope and faith that in the next 150 years, we will see a different Canada, and perhaps we'll be having birthday celebrations that aren't quite so distasteful. The massive PR campaigns that we are currently enmeshed in startle me on a regular basis, because surely we are not celebrating 150 years of colonization and genocide. So then what are we doing in response to this massive PR campaign? And what are we doing to change that paradigm? Changes that I see around me just recently. So I'm driving in my car about 2 weeks ago, and all of a sudden I hear on the radio, I wasn't really paying attention, and all of a sudden I hear my MP on a public service announcement, and he's explaining what National Aboriginal Day is and urging people to go and engage with events on National Aboriginal Day. I was astonished. That was awesome. And just recently, my daughter graduated from her undergraduate degree, and at her convocation, they opened the convocation with an invocation of the territory, an acknowledgement of the traditional territory that the university is on. And then they also, in the keynote speech at the convocation, they raised up Indian residential schools and how everybody had the opportunity to have access to university. This is also, that certainly did not happen when I graduated from university. So, hope and faith. Let your life speak. Climb the mountain. He's shown us the mountain. And now we have to do the climbing ourselves. I said I would only ask you 2 things, so I'm not asking you now, but I'm just going to offer to you a few other pieces. One of the things that we did with Quakers last year, Quakers have an annual gathering, an annual national gathering. And so one of the things that we did at the annual national gathering last year is we brought forward some asks for Quakers to take home to their meetings, to their Quaker congregations. So I'm just going to share those asks with you, and if it's the kind of thing that you would like to share with your congregation, I would be happy to send you the exact language if that's useful to you, but I'm just going to share those asks. So this is what we ask Quakers across the country: to continue to educate themselves, including children and youth, about the doctrine of discovery, the ongoing effects of colonialism, the UN Declaration, residential schools and their legacy, the history of the land on which they live, and reconciliation efforts. To formally acknowledge the traditional territories where they are located and engage in processes of reflection on the meaning of this. Such acknowledgement can't be just routine. You need to spend some time. What is the meaning of that acknowledgement? To find out about current concerns of Indigenous peoples from those territories, including land appropriation or resource development, which with the meeting or congregation could be engaged. To investigate projects of cultural revitalization that Indigenous peoples are involved in, and discern if there is an appropriate role, including funding, that you can play. And finally, to uphold and support individuals involved with grassroots Indigenous rights and provide spiritual support to those led to do that work. So I have hope and I have faith that after today's day of teachings and information, that people can go away with some increased knowledge on these things. And I want to leave you with a pithy quote So this comes from Grand Chief Littlechild at the closing events in Ottawa of the TRC, where he said to the plenary room, "The 7 most important words in this work are, I'm sorry, I love you, thank you." So thank you for having me with you here today.